Disruptors and Curious Minds. Welcome back to the Thinking on Paper book club, where each week we talk about a chapter from the book that we are reading. And this week we are still on the Nexus, Augmented Thinking for a Complex World by Julio Ottino with Bruce Mao, not and Bruce Mao. I don't know if the with and the and is anything to notice or
It's
not.
kind of like when there's like a special star that that they want to highlight in a TV show. They always say with somebody. So I don't know if the with is a bump or a last minute ad. I'm sure it's the former.
I think it's like Bruce Mao so special he gets a with. And yeah, chapter 6. We're jumping into the quantum realm, thinking at the nexus in a complex world, complex system-based thinkings that reveal new insights. Quantum insight. There's a I don't know. I'll read the first intro. We live in a complex world. Having a framework to guide thoughts is essential. It is important to recognize the difference between complicated and complex before distilling relevant lessons that stem from complex systems theory. Network science gives insights into teams. Complexity serves to highlight the difference between engineered system and biological systems, a powerful metaphor in understanding organizations. Before we get into quantum computing, Jeremy, I'd like to ask you a question. This is your field of expertise. You seem to be very good at this. Could you explain to our audience the difference between complex and complicated systems?
Oh yeah, I think so. I have a good analogy that I like to use on this one is complex and complicated. So complicated is, let's go to a musical reference, right? Imagine that, me in a musical
Yep.
reference. But
Who would have thought it?
it's weird, right?
I know.
So complicated is classical music. All right. Complicated is classical music because it's highly organized. It's in depth. It's not just one guitar playing. It's like hundreds of instruments all doing their own little part that are dependent on one another. I think what Julio uses is kind of an airplane itself as a complex system, right? Because there are redundancies that happen within airplanes and that sort of thing. But I flip to complex, and I think about that as jazz, right?
Jazz.
So jazz is a little more emergent than structured, right? But there are a lot of different things that can happen when you're in a jazz jam, right? It inputs, feed outputs, and the pieces of the jazz jam are influenced by other pieces happening at the same time. So there's emergence in one complex, and there's a hierarchy of systems in complicated.
Okay.
As I understand it.
Yep, I like that explanation. Complex systems. I like the nature's version of complex systems. I like the shoal of fish moving in unison, the flock of bird, the food hierarchy of a reservoir where you have all these insurmountable individual components. One of the things I took from it that a complex system cannot be. You can't reduce it. Reductionism doesn't work. You need to look at a complex system as a whole, not the individual parts. I think Julio speaks, to understand a desert, you can't look at a grain of sand. I like
Right,
those.
but that's counter to human nature, right?
Yes.
We want to reduce everything to figure it out, right? It also goes back to like mechanics, right? The mechanics of things. It talks about, I think Richard Feynman was brought up in this with his like little Feynman diagrams of how like small quantum things work, and reducing it to a mechanical thought process kind of helps our brain get around what it is, but not everything can be fully reduced because of things like butterfly effect. I think of butterfly effect in a complex system where a butterfly flaps its wings in Australia, and somehow that little motion creates something happening in the Mediterranean with a weather system, right?
Yep. Chaos.
Right.
Serendipitous.
Well, interesting. So chaos comes up a little bit too, right? And chaos, when I first like started thinking about, this was years ago, I was like, oh, chaos has just got to be entirely random, right? Chaos is just uncontrollable random stuff, but chaos has a theory. Like there's something called chaos theory, which is more in a complex system than a complicated system. And chaos, so think about, you mentioned birds, right?
Yeah.
Starling, right? You see starling big flock of starling floating around, and they seem very organized, making these shapes and always darting in one side and another. And there was this program, I don't know if it was referenced in here, but I remember reading about it. This guy created a program called Boids, Boids, which is like the New Jersey way of saying birds, I guess, right?
Oh, okay, Boids.
Boids.
Yeah, some Boids with my coffee.
Right, that's right. So you got a little Boston in there too. You're dipping a little Boston in there. So all right, so the program basically had a theory, like an algorithm that said something like, you know, if the bird to the left of you moved, you had to follow that first motion. If the bird in front of you moved a certain way, you had to do certain things. So it was like 3 structured things, but it looks like chaos while there is a bit of organization. Again, back to the jazz thing, there's tonality, right? So we're all playing in a certain key, at least at one point, right? So there's a tonality to a chaotic system. I guess that's how I think about it.
A tonality and a beauty to
100%,
system.
100% agree.
There's, so continuing the complex system, back in the book, there's some lovely complex network diagrams here. There's some lessons. So Julio outlines 4 lessons that you can learn from thinking about or understanding, or probably thinking about more than understand, complex systems. They are: respect and prepare for emergence. Seeing the limits of control and top-down actions helps us understand the world and helps us organize our own systems. Organizations, for example, should be thought of as biological systems rather than engineered systems, those that do not adapt and evolve, disappear. Recognize the possibility of hidden connections. Be unsurprised by seemingly unexpected linkages and recognize the possibility of hidden connections. Be prepared for failures. I think we all love this one. Failure is the route to success. And embrace complementarity. How would someone from Boston say that?
Oh man, that's hard to say even just in my own.
I don't think I'm getting it right. And chaos and order are not opposites.
So if we look at those kind of individually, right? So the complementarity thing is really interesting. The idea of holding 2 perspectives in your head at the same time, right? Two differing perspectives, 2 opposite perspectives. In our brain,
here's with the F. Scott Fitzgerald quote.
Exactly. Do you have that handy?
Page 200. Yes.
Yeah, read that if you have it handy.
I will read that. In his short story, The Crack Up, F. Scott Fitzgerald famously wrote, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." I could barely function reading that sentence. So,
well, I think that's the root to everything, not just being a Nexus thinker, but there has to be an openness to holding alternate perspectives, like viewing something from the opposite side, and that creates empathy, right? You have to have empathy, or actually you have to have empathy, I think, to hold those 2 things. Because if you and I hold opposing viewpoints, I'm locked in. Like my viewpoint has become my belief. My belief I will defend with my ego, right? You do the same thing on your side, but there's nothing productive about that, right? So I have to be curious about you, and I have to be open and empathetic to your viewpoint, and then I can hold these 2 things in my brain at the same time. Very difficult. But another thing I found interesting, I think there's a list by Herbert Simon, I think, that that just was on creative individuals. But I think this applies to Nexus thinkers, and the list that he had on this one. Actually, you know what? I'm jumping ahead of myself. That's chapter 7. Let's back up.
Listeners, come back next week, chapter 7. You'll hear about Herbert Simon.
But it's very similar to what you said in your list, right? But I think generally, isn't there an openness that you have to be a Nexus thinker, right? You can't be too rigid in what you think the world is, right?
Yeah, I think one of the, I don't know if I am answering your question in the right way, but don't diverge so quickly. And I think that when you diverge, are you closing that open-mindedness? Is that,
or don't converge too quickly?
Don't converge too quickly.
Right. Don't converge. And I think he talks about that a lot. Absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe there's something there on creativity.
Well, that's hard though, Mark. Let me ask you a question. Like,
oh God,
if you're researching something and you're trying to find the answer to something, and you find something that could potentially be the answer, like, don't you want to be like, that's the answer? Not just you, but humans, right? Like once the answer comes up, we want to be like, oh, I found it. Eureka. Like what, right?
I must be built differently because depending on what I'm reading, researching, or writing, I'm so paranoid and skeptical of almost everything I read. I was like, that seems like the answer. It can't be the answer. There must be something else, or maybe the answer's too simple. It's, how have I found the answer so suddenly or so quickly? It must be wrong. And I tend to question that a lot.
You smell like a Nexus thinker, man.
But then I smell like something. Yeah. Sure. I just, unless there's anything you want, I just wanted to bring up the part about team building, complexity in team building. I think it's pretty actionable advice that Julio speaks about in here. Taking lessons from complex systems for forming teams, and he used a couple of examples. The example I like best is the one about Broadway, and they went through all the successful Broadway play, all the productions of the last, well, since it began, I don't know when, like in 19 something, and took apart every successful production and looked at the team dynamics to see what was the secret of a successful Broadway team. And surprisingly small, 6 or 7 people, which for me, I was quite surprised by that. You'd think it'd be much bigger than that, but it isn't. And then it was about veterans versus new, young writers, producers, runners, set designers, etc. And then how many in that team were friends versus complete strangers. And it was unsurprisingly like a balance of those things, an odd number, some veterans, some fresh behind the ears, new to the Broadway experience, and then some of them knew each other and some of them didn't.
Didn't it skew slightly towards veterans, if anything, and like have a little bit more veterans and bring new energy to disrupt the veterans, so to speak? I want to say
everybody knowing each other was not good. A team of strangers meeting for the first time as part of a team was not good either. Of course, everybody wants to know what the best ratio is. A rough encapsulation of Uzi and Spiro's finding. First, it's better to have an odd-sized group. It makes decision-making easier.
Yep.
And then does my answer.
So I think to take the Thinking on Paper book club to the next level, we need to bring in people that we don't know to talk about this stuff with us if we want to prove the theory. So if you're listening, sitting there on your laptop or your mobile device and you've read the book or not read the book, jump into one of these with us. And all you got to do is send us a note, right?
I found it. Best advice when forming a dream team, try to include experienced people, especially individuals you have worked with before, but bring in new players as well. The temptation to work mainly with your friends will eventually hurt your team's performance.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Keeps us on our toes, you know? So a couple things I want to talk about. Two things that I found really interesting. One is the idea of invisible college, which I thought was pretty cool. And it talks about how back in the day, scientists would write each other letters back and forth on what they were doing and how they were approaching things and kind of what was important to them. Right. So you have, Niels Bohr and Einstein, who were on opposite sides of a lot of arguments, but they were kind of sussing things out through these series of letters. And I would argue, like, Thinking on Paper for me in the book club specifically for me is kind of like an invisible college, except we're doing it a little more automated. So I found that was really interesting. And that ties into something else that that he calls reframing, which I think is really interesting. Like, what do you remember reading about that? And how does that land with you on just reframing to grow and connect ideas?
Well, our good friend Corrales speaks about reframing a lot. And I think that maybe is that the failure, embracing failure. You can reframe failure as a stepping stone to success. You can reframe negativity into opportunity. Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah, so I think that's important from a personal growth perspective. Like, for sure, the one thing I've thought was interesting in this story was Vannevar Bush's essay that he wrote, back in 1945 in the Atlantic, related to, technology and computers and human interaction and that sort of thing. And because of how it was put out and the publication where it was placed, it didn't lead to adoption of the theories that came out of that until a new version of that was reframed in Life magazine, more accessible publication, but also probably reduced the complexities of the message as well. So that's what I was thinking on a reframing piece of the puzzle is, how do you apply the same thing to a different audience in order for that audience to kind of grasp it and land on some of those concepts?
Okay. And so would that cross over with context somewhat, where the article appeared in Time and the history and context of Time magazine made it more accessible to or more interesting perhaps to a different audience?
Yeah, I think the audiences always have like little highways that, connect you to that audience, and you have to speak in a different way. You have to approach the audience in a different way. So reframing is just really interesting. It also requires a bit of openness, which I think is like a theme of this chapter. If I could say, anything that I take away from this is kind of having an openness to new ideas, and notice when you're locking into behavior that is tied to a specific belief that might end up holding you back.
I like that.
Yeah.
I can't really add to that. I think that the beauty in the complexity, you've answered it there. So I will leave it at that.
All right. Chapter 6. We're good. Stay tuned for the next one. We're going to continue to unpack the last few chapters of this book and get jumping on our next one. The Nexus is
yeah, and if you like what you hear, check out thinkingonpaper.xyz and look at some of our amazing guests. A lot of our interviews, a lot of our shows kind of interweave with the lessons that we're learning in the Nexus. So there's a good synergy between those. So check it out, and we'll see you next week.